All right, at this point, we know what we want to do. We want to estimate this total. And we've told JavaScript when to do it, when this form is submitted. And we've made sure that this one required field will be filled out. So now it's time to start collecting those various values from these fields and using them in the actual JavaScript code. So scrolling down here, down here in my estimate total function, I'm going to start collecting these values. So I'm basically going to do document.getElementById several times. I'm going to use the var keyword to create a series of variables that will hold the values of the different things I'm interested in. So I'm going to create these names first. I'm going to use the prefix BTL on this just to indicate that it's a bottle so I can keep track of what I'm doing here. I'm going to go with the cold, the extra, and the garlic. Let's put extra first because it is the first one listed on the page. Then I'm going to need the state and the shipping method. And then anything special will be looked at later. Okay, so I've just used this var keyword, but none of these actually has a value yet, so we need to do that. So I'm going to assign each of these in turn using document.getElementById. Now, of course, I'm not going to use state for each one of these, but it gets everything in place. Okay, so what I really want is the value of this field right here. So I'm going to split my window again so I can see two things at once. Scroll up. And here's the ID that I want. So the value from the extra field will be here, and I need to look at its value property. Whoops. So I'm going to do that with each of these three bottle types. So the first one is Q extra, the next one's Q cold, and the next one's Q garlic. Very good. So we have these variables that will contain these much longer expressions. And so later on in my code, I can just use this instead of spelling this whole thing out. So I can just get the value of the state field, like that. And then for the shipping method, I'm going to need to loop over these. So for that, I'm just going to use var again here, and I'm going to use methods, and then document.getElementById. And I'll use the form name, as we've seen before. Here we go, cart oil. And I'm going to use the name of these radio buttons, which is our method. Okay, so now I've collected those. Now I'm going to use a for loop. Now this for loop is going to just do something a certain number of times. And what I want is for it to look at each of these radio buttons in turn until it finds the one that's checked. So I'm going to create a little variable called I and set it to 0 because this is an array and I want the first one when I start this. And now I'm going to set the upper bound, which will be the length of that method's array. And I'm going to increment this by 1 every time I go through this loop. So what I need to do is check if the current method radio button that I'm looking at is checked. So I can use that I to check that particular index in the methods array and say, is the thing checked? In other words, is the checked property of that particular radio button true? And if it is, I'm going to set shipping method to the value of this radio button. And in fact, just to make this make a little more sense, I'm going to cut this and put it down here. So these two go together, and all these that are simpler go together as well. So I've looped over my radio buttons to collect all of those. And now I know its value right here in shipping method. So now that I've collected these values, seemingly, I want to make sure that it really worked. So let's try logging some of these things to the console. I'm just going to copy this over several times. Okay, so I'm going to try logging each of these values that I've collected in turn. Now I'm ready to save this file, switch back over to my browser and reload it, and bring up the JavaScript console. There we go. So let's fill out a couple of values. Let's go with 4, 8, and 12. Choose the state, and we'll switch this to US mail and try estimating the total. There we go. So here in my console, I can see that I collected the values correctly. 4, 8, and 12, they're in order. The state is Illinois, and the shipping method is USPS or US mail. So now I've actually collected those values and used them in my actual page. We'll be moving on next to starting to do the calculation based on these actual values.